Hey guys, if anybody's joining me yet, chime right in so I know I've got some company going here. And let me know if everything looks okay in the backdrop because we're not really quite ready to go. We got about 3 minutes, but I want to see who we've got on here. So if you are there, we got a packed day today on the Deplorable report, and I'm hoping a lot of you are going to join in because I've done a lot of research for this show today, and I think you're going to find it pretty interesting. I'm not sure how many of you have taken the time yet to read my blog. I just put that out last night, and I'm going to be kind of going over a lot of what's in there today. It's going to be a packed show, so don't leave. This is going to be a lot of research that I've done, and I'm getting more the hang of it. We got about 2 minutes, see who else is going to join us. We're getting quite a few people in here, so I'm really glad to see that you found me. And if you can chime in, please do. Let me know that you're out there watching. I'd like to begin today by talking about a blog that I wrote last night. I don't know how many of you have actually read it, but I did a ton of research for it, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. I think you're going to find it really interesting. So chime in with any comments that you can. And for those of you who are just joining me, I'm Kathy Chamberlain, your host. With the Deplorable report. Here we avenge fake news with fact-based truth, and with a little spin by using Saul Alinsky's tactics to show how they're being used against us in all sorts of news that we see going on today. And today we have a really special report that is very timely, and it has to do with the WHO. Who is the WHO? Well, we know they're called the World Health Organization. My blog, if you have read it, and if you haven't, is basically called, the title of it is Taiwan's Warnings Ignored by the WHO, Costing Lives Worldwide. Now, why do I say that cost us lives worldwide? Because we're not really hearing too much about Taiwan, are we? Have you heard anything about Taiwan's interference in this and how they tried to warn the world? No. That's why I'm going to bring you that news here today. So you're joining me on the Deplorable report, where we're avenging fake news with fact-based truth. Now I'm going to prove my case. I'm going to prove to you why, if we had listened to Taiwan, we'd be in a heck of a lot better position today. And interestingly enough, Taiwan message wasn't able to get out to us because they've had this ongoing dispute with China for decades now. And China refuses to allow Taiwan their independence, and that all plays a part in this. And had we been allowed to listen and to hear what Taiwan had to tell us back in December of 2019, we would have saved a lot of lives, and our economy would not be in the downfall that it's in. So let's kind of research that together and take a look at what exactly happened. And it all really has its basis back in 2003, believe it or not. In 2003, that's when the SARS epidemic was unleashed. Now, what does the SARS epidemic have to do with any of this, you might ask? Let me tell you, it has everything to do with it, because back in 2002 and 2003, a very similar respiratory pathogen was released in China that almost and could have caused a worldwide pandemic, only for the fact that China was able to get that one under control because it wasn't quite so contagious as the COVID-19 that we're seeing wreak havoc on the world today. But if you had read my blog back on March 25th, it was called The Real Killer Isn't a Virus, It's the Left's War on Capitalism. So all this ties in, bear with me, I'm going to show you how by the end of this report. And in that report, I quote an expert on China affairs, and I just saw him, as a matter of fact, last night on, I believe it was the Laura Ingraham show, I'm not quite sure, but what he said recently was, quote, the deadly SARS virus has escaped twice from the Beijing lab where it was being used in experiments. Both were quickly contained, but neither would have happened at all if proper safety precautions had been taken. Okay, so we know for a fact that twice now deadly pathogens have escaped from a lab in China. Where was this lab in China? Take a guess. Wuhan. And this is the same exact lab as is being suspect by many experts in the release of COVID-19. I covered that in a previous blog, so if you haven't read my blogs, make sure to go and sign up for them at the Deplorable report. And you'll be updated on this stuff in a more timely fashion. But let me share with you now why Taiwan has anything at all to do with this. Okay, when they saw that the 2003 SARS almost escaped, they were smart about it. Not like the rest of the world. What they did, since they are neighbors after all of China, what they did was they started putting precautions together. They built strategies, and in these strategies, they made sure that they had stockpiles of masks. They had drills of bioweapon wars, basically. They affixed all of their retail shops with sanitizing. Way back then, they started taking these precautions, and they built up, they even had ventilators built up. They had it all figured out, had we only really followed their lead. They started this back in 2003, so they were quite prepared for what was to come in December of 2019. Now, let's fast forward to there. When do we know for a fact that the first COVID patient zero, they call them, made its presence? Well, we know from the experts, they pretty much narrowed it down to November 17th. That's a long time ago. They didn't know at that time that that's what the person had, of course. You know, now hindsight it makes it all much more simple. However, on December 8th, guess who reported? Sorry, my glasses are a little bit crooked. I don't know if they are. I keep looking in there and seeing them, but don't get distracted by that. I need them to read. But back on December 8th, WHO, the World Health Organization, reported that's when the first official case actually occurred. So why didn't we know about that? Well, we kind of sort of did, but nobody was making a big deal out of it because there's something called human-to-human transmission. And when that occurs, human-to-human, that is the first sign a pandemic could be on the horizon. So that's what everybody looks for. That is the marker, let's say. And that's what alerts the world to these red flags that we better be really careful. Okay, so at the end of December, so all that time is going by from December 8th to the end of December, and a lot more people in China are getting infected. It didn't go exponentially really large though, so a lot of people really weren't paying attention to this, and that's kind of excusable, I suppose. But what happened toward the end of December changed everything. Taiwan, because of their proximity to China, they had to be extra special careful. They knew this was coming. It was just a matter of when, not if. And they had certain people in place that communicated with doctors inside of China to find out when this stuff was going on, if a pandemic was on its way outside of the Chinese borders. They wanted to find out what's really going on inside China. They needed to know, and so does the rest of the world, quite frankly. Okay, so they had doctors communicating from inside Taiwan, inside the Chinese border. And it just happened that some of those doctors were located in Wuhan. So when the Taiwanese counterparts started finding out that those folks in Wuhan, the doctors, were catching this disease, they realized for the very first time that it was human-to-human transmissible. So that was the big key, and that's what everybody was watching for. So on December 30th, the first basically whistleblower, I guess you could say, from China, inside China, in Wuhan, Dr. Li, he was a very healthy 30-something-year-old physician. inside one of the hospitals, and he started posting online warnings that human to human transmission was occurring, but nobody would listen. And in fact, the Chinese arrested him and some of his colleagues who were also posting online. Okay, are we getting an understanding here how China just wanted to keep this whole thing under wraps? Oh, it gets so much worse, folks. And the WHO, once they start getting involved, they just get more and more involved with the cover-up. So that's what we want to find out about, because that's what's in the news so much today. So Dr. Lee gets arrested. He gets thrown in jail. He gets questioned, and he gets basically he is told to shut up, or his life basically depends on it. What happens to Dr. Lee? He's dead now. He later died. Now they say it was the virus, but was it? On December 31st, one day after he is arrested, and by the way, after Taiwan alerts WHO, the World Health Organization, they alerted WHO. Now, Taiwan is not a member of the World Health Organization. They want to be. They have tried for years to be a member, but guess who keeps getting in the way? China. China does not want to admit that Taiwan is independent of the mainland. Okay, and this fight has been going on for quite some time, decades and decades. So this is a huge thing to China. They will not do business. They will not talk to anyone. They will not even discuss Taiwan with anybody. If anyone they're doing business with talks about Taiwan as a separate entity from China, China will come down hard on them. So this is something they've been doing for decades. So towards the end of December, Taiwan started blowing the alarm. They started telling WHO and pretty much anyone that would listen, except nobody listened to them. The WHO certainly didn't listen, because China was telling the WHO, they were saying, don't listen to Taiwan. And WHO ignored Taiwan's warnings. This is back towards the end of December, folks, when something could have been done about this entire nightmare that the entire world now is living in. On December 31st was the very first time China then finally, because they probably felt compelled to tell the WHO, they told the WHO that the endemic at that time, the pathogen, that there was a disease going on, but that's all they said. They said, we don't really know much about this. We just know that it's a pathogen that's going around. It's like the flu. We don't think it's anything more than that. And they really downplayed it. Okay, now Taiwan is beginning their preparation for this pandemic, which they knew it was going to turn into, because they knew it was human to human. You see, that's the difference between whether something is an endemic or a pandemic. Of course, pandemic refers to the entire world now is prone to getting the disease, that it's gone global. However, unless it is human to human, then it's considered harmless and it's containable. So Taiwan didn't allow that to prevent them from protecting their country, and they did a damn good job. Wait until I tell you the numbers out of Taiwan today. So basically, Taiwan starts testing all their people right away. They know that testing is critical. It's critical, folks. You have to start testing right away, because you can't contain somebody you don't know has the disease, right? So in order to contain people, you must start tests. Taiwan started right out of the gates, and they started testing their folks. They started getting the masks out that they had stockpiled for just such an endemic. And they also, by the way, had stockpiled the ventilators, and they had strategy plans for quarantining. These people had it all together, and they should have been the ones we were listening to, not the WHO. So let's go on. What happened shortly after that? This is what should really upset every American, everybody in the world who's listening to this broadcast. China started buying up supplies. Their buying streak begins They start going worldwide, not just buying from their neighbors. No, 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 no. Not just buying out from the entire world on their own, from their own companies. They start directing their agents from within foreign countries to be the first in line to buy their supplies too. That's evil. They knew the pandemic was coming, and they start emptying store shelves basically globally. How different is that than the folks you saw hoarding the toilet paper here? No difference whatsoever, except that toilet paper doesn't save lives. But the stuff that China was hoarding does. They are the exact reason why we have no supplies, no PPEs for our nurses and doctors. Wait till I tell you what I've uncovered. So as they are going around the world buying up all the supplies because they knew what was coming, they continue to feed the WHO erroneous information about this virus. They refuse to admit that it's human to human. This is where Alinsky tactics come in. Now, for those of you who don't know what Alinsky tactics are, whoops, I just lost you. I hope, oh, there you are. Okay, cool. Saul Alinsky wrote a book back in the 70s. Now, he's known as the father of community organizing, and he's the very man who taught 13 tactics that are today used by the left, including our former President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. She wrote her thesis on Saul Alinsky. He was her idol. Now, he wrote a book called Rules for Radicals. And for those of you who have never heard of it before, that's what it looks like, Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky. He wrote this book back in the 70s. And it includes 13 tactics by which the left can use against conservatives to turn our country to socialism. That's what it's all about, folks. And those tactics are used worldwide now because who has sent his book over to various different countries of the world? George Soros, believe it or not. He has sent that book out globally to turn democracies into socialist countries. That's a fact, and I write about that in my book. What I've done in my book, I take every one of Saul Alinsky's tactics, his 13 tactics, and write them and include them in this book, Rules for Deplorables, and you can get your copy on Amazon. But every chapter of my book starts with one of Alinsky's tactics, and I explain the tactic by using a current event. There are over 400 footnotes in my book. And everything we see the left do today, and you can bet your bottom dollar the WHO is part of the left's attack. They are globalists. It's really come down to globalist versus free market today. And the WHO is part of the globalist movement. Now, the Alinsky tactic that I'm going to share with you that's been used by China and by the WHO in their cover-up of what China has done to the world with this pandemic is tactic number 3. Whenever possible, go outside, rather, the experience of your enemy. What does that mean? Whenever possible, go outside the experience of your enemy. That means do the unexpected. That means lie if you have to. That means fool them any way you can. That means that when you explain certain situations to your enemy, you just keep them confused. And that way you can get your goal accomplished. And this is what we've witnessed over the past several months. They have bamboozled the world with the complicity of the WHO, and I'm going to prove it here with the rest of what I have to say. Think about this. Now, I put together a timeline, and you can get that on the website, thedeplorablereport.com. Under documents, look for documents. And I spent a considerable amount of time putting together this timeline. And the reason that I did is because all this stuff goes by and we forget what really happened at the beginning of this whole ordeal. But when you take a look at that timeline, you're going to be shocked at what we knew and when we knew it and who knew what they knew at given times. So let's start off with January 14th. We already know that Taiwan told the WHO, and by the way, they told China too, so there is no excuse. Taiwan is saying, their vice president and their leadership is telling the world now that they forewarned not just the WHO, but also China themselves on January 30th to the 31st. They were telling anyone who would listen. So how did they know it was human-to-human transmission, by the way? Because the doctors in China, in hospitals in Wuhan, were telling the doctors in Taiwan that they were catching this disease from their patients. And by that point, they still didn't know what the disease was. They didn't have a name for it. They knew it was a SARS-like disease. They knew it was respiratory, but that's as far as they knew. So let's skip now to January 14th. That's the next kind of critical date. The WHO tweets out to the world that China denies that this flu-like disease has a human-to-human transmission. So China deliberately lies, not just to the American people, but to the entire world. This lost incredible time that we could have been bracing for this. So the WHO repeats China's claim that there is no human-to-human transmission. That's on January 14th. On January 15th, can anybody guess what happened? The very next day, we had here in America our first COVID-19 victim in Washington, the state of Washington. Okay, so we can see how quickly now this narrative is going to move, because on January 19th, 4 days after we have our first victim here, the WHO publicly, once again, blames animal transmission. But they say that if there's very limited human-to-human. Okay, so they're kind of starting to brace the world that this could well become a pandemic, but they don't do it yet. This again, January 19th, we're looking at 3 weeks, almost 3 weeks after Taiwan tried to warn the world. Now remember, the World Health Organization is supposed to be the one to do that. So this should anger everybody. By January 26th, this is another week wasted, and I'm going to share with you in a few minutes how devastating those wasted weeks cost the world, and how many lives it cost, and how many economies it ruined by us not knowing the truth when we could have. But remember, China, and I'm going to share with you why. What motivated China to want to do this? They have their reasons. By January 26th, Taiwan, now this is kind of interesting, this took me by surprise, but Taiwan actually, only on January 26th, they banned travel to and from Wuhan, from their tiny little island just east of China. That surprised me because Taiwan has a lot of citizens in mainland China and in Wuhan, and vice versa. There's a lot of Chinese in Taiwan. So the travel between the two is pretty fluent. But they waited until January 26th, which, okay, why would they have done that? Now, let's remember that on January 31st, only 4 days later, our president, well, I'll say 5 days later, our president, Donald Trump, banned travel from China. And remember, he was called a racist and a xenophobe and all sorts of names. And by the way, when the left calls our president names, or any of us, because we're speaking the truth, that's another Alinsky tactic. That one is tactic number 5, and it's the most used tactic that he teaches. That is, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. So whenever they don't like something that is said by conservatives or by someone they disagree with, remember Hillary, you homophobe, you xenophobe, you a racist, you sexist, and my favorite, you deplorable. That's how I got the title of my book, of course. But that is their tactic number 5. So look for that. Whenever they start calling somebody names, and of course what they're hoping for the reaction is one they have gotten for decades from conservative politicians. What do? They cower because everyone's now looking at them. Now the spotlight's on them. They're the xenophobe. Well, Trump doesn't cower, and that's what we should appreciate about him so much. No, he held firm. He stood strong. Not only that, a week later or two, he stopped all travel from Iran. Later, the next week, he stopped it all from Europe. Thank God for that. And I'm going to show you why that saved possibly hundreds of thousands, if not many more lives. So on January 30th, now this is interesting, January 30th, so this is 1 full month after Taiwan tried to warn the world. The WHO declares an international public health emergency for the very first time. And they tweeted that human-to-human transmission outside China remains low. What does that tell you? Remains low. How could they not know? China was getting beat up with all their deaths. We were watching videos of the Chinese police, the Gestapo, raiding people's apartments. You know, do you know that they locked people into their apartments and some they only found dead weeks later? These are some of the reports coming out of brave Chinese people from within the country. But while all this was going on, the WHO is telling us that transmission remained low. The very next day, what does Trump do? He's not listening to that bull crap anymore, and he puts the ban on all Chinese travel. That should tell you, folks, that he was on top of this no matter what the WHO was telling the rest of the world. And by the way, other countries in the world didn't listen to him. Do you know that Italy could have stopped their travel from China, but they didn't do it because the WHO is out there saying all sorts of stuff about how stopping travel to China is a racist thing to do. The WHO said that, the Director General of the WHO. So on February 14th, now we're skipping from February 3rd. Remember, just February 3rd, and just a week later, 2 weeks later, on February 14th, this is very odd, folks. Listen to this. I'll bet you haven't heard of this in the mainstream media. China announces out of the blue, without anybody asking them, without anybody even really suspecting this as a potential possibility, China announced that it was enforcing new safety precautions at the Wuhan Institute, which apparently is a level 4 laboratory that handles biological specimens and pathogens, that is just outside that wet market. Now that's kind of strange, don't you think? If you don't believe in coincidences, like I don't believe in coincidences, you might want to find out a little bit more about that. Now, I did write a blog a couple of weeks ago about this very topic, and you should check that one out. That's an incredible blog. I'm trying to find what the title of that blog was. Yeah, the real killer isn't a virus, it's the left's war on capitalism. Go check that blog out from March 25th, and you'll find out just how possible it is that this entire pandemic, this pathogen, was released from that lab. Now, when you combine that with the fact that all of a sudden on February 14th, the President Xi of China sends back some of his top generals to that level 4 lab, the only one in their country, by the way, the only level 4 lab in their country, the highest level that you can have for bioweaponry. And they're not supposed to have any bioweapons. I mean, we have a treaty with them from, I think it's 1984. So this is something that gives them reason to want to hide all of this. Now, whether it was intentionally released or something that they released because of sloppiness, which the SARS virus has already been released. We know that for a fact twice in the past. So, and by the way, and if you read my blog from back then, you'll find out that the reason that the mode of release is twofold. One, if it wasn't intentional, quite possibly it could have been either brought out on a one of the participants, one of the lab workers' clothing, that it had leaked out that way, or they even, there's a propensity apparently for these underlings who work in these labs as janitors or what have you, that they'll take these animals that have been experimented on just for some extra money, even though it's against all protocol, and they'll take it to that nearby wet market and sell it on the open market. Can you believe that? That's a fact as well. And if you go back to my blog, you'll find out where I got all those sources from. I never quote anything unless I have some pretty darn good sources, folks, as you'll know if you've read my book. At any rate, now let's move along to February 21st. Now we're almost at 2 months, going on to 2 months after this was first known to be human to human. WHO comes out and defends China by tweeting this. Listen to this quote: "The measures China has taken has given us a fighting chance of containing the spread." So already they're laying the groundwork to protect China when the shit hits the fan, basically. Now on February 27th, the CDC, and the CDC has a lot of explaining to do too, by the way. The CDC tweets that per China, quote, "The evidence we have is that there does not appear to be widespread community transmission." Did you get that? The CDC, our CDC, they tweeted from information that they felt China was telling them. The evidence we have is that there doesn't appear to be widespread community transmission. Is it any coincidence that on March 9th was the last appearance of the CDC at the White House briefings? Didn't you ever wonder where they went? Remember at the beginning, they were out there talking all the time, along with our president and the rest of the scientists? Now, we know they botched the testing. That's one of their main purposes, is these Center for Disease Control. This is their mandate, folks. But they botched the testing. We know now the testing is critical. It's the first thing Taiwan came out came out with their population was testing. Because we can't contain anybody if we don't know they're sick. And now we know so many of these folks do not have symptoms. So one thing we know for sure, and listen to this evidence that I have come across. One thing we do know for sure is that time is of the essence with this epidemic, with this pandemic, with this particular disease. How do we know that? Well, there was a recent study done on COVID-19. So this is very recent. This study was done by the University of Southampton. So it's given quite a bit of credibility. And this study was funded, believe it or not, by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, if you're like me, you don't give a whole lot of credibility to a lot of stuff that comes out of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For those of you who might be shocked to hear that, those of us who have dug really, really deep, we follow the money on an awful lot of stuff that is going on in the world. And we know that there's some nefarious stuff that has been uncovered and alliances that have gone on between the Gates family, George Soros, the WHO, and some other unsavory characters. But let me tell you what the research found. Given that it came from the Gates Foundation, I think both those who give the Gates Foundation credibility and those who don't can take this for pretty much fact. The research found, catch this, that, quote, if interventions in China could have been conducted 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks earlier, cases could have been reduced by 66%, 86%, and 95% respectively. Did you get that? 95%. That's what number you keep hearing get bandied about on the news now. This is where it's from. This study from the University of Southampton, funded by the Gates Foundation. They say that this could have significantly limited the geographical spread of the disease. Folks, this is significant. I want to break this down so you really understand with the numbers how this comes out. Let's look at the numbers. Today, Taiwan has a population of 23 million people. So it's very small, so it's very hard. You know, a lot of scientists will look at this and say, well, you can't really compare a country with 23 million people to a country like the United States with 330 million. Okay, but why not? You know, we can compare it to small little cities then, couldn't we, with a like size? But let's just take these numbers for what they're worth and see where they take us. Taiwan, 23 million people. Today, 379, no zeros after that, folks, 379 people have been confirmed with COVID-19. Of those, only 5 confirmed deaths in the entire country of 23 million. And by the way, I got to look this up. If anybody comes up with this answer, please comment on this thread so that I can see it on here, and I'll announce it to folks. But I wonder what is the population in Wuhan? It seems like it's around 30 million, if I remember. It seems like I read that somewhere, but if anyone comes up with that number, pop it up here on the screen. So that's Taiwan. Now, in America, we have 330 million population, correct? As of today, last time I checked, 404,580 were confirmed with the virus, and 13,000 deaths have been attributed to it. Okay, well, we have a lot more people, so it just goes, it just makes sense that we'd have a lot more confirmations and a lot more deaths, right? Not really. Look at what, if you extrapolate those numbers, let's take a look at it. We find that the United States is 14.35 times larger than Taiwan. So when you use that factor, if we were the size of Taiwan, given the amount of confirmations that we have, we would actually today have 5,437 confirmed folks with the virus. 5,000, if the size was the same on each, our number to their 379 confirmed would be 5,437 confirmed. Instead of how many? 404,580. Wow. That really hits home, doesn't it? So if we had started the testing, if we had started the same, put the same strategies in place that Taiwan has been building since when? Since 2003, they've been preparing for this. If we had all the PPEs stored away like they did, who messed up there? It was under the CDC. Remember, I went over this last week. So under HHS, they were supposed to have the stockpile of all the PPEs we would need in a pandemic like this. What happened to those, if you recall from last week? Well, back in 2009, which was it? The H1N1 pandemic hit. And we went through our whole stockpile. Now, that's what it's intended for, so there's no harm done, right? Except that Obama never replaced, in 7-8 years, never replaced the stockpile of the PPEs that were used in the H1N1 swine flu. So we didn't have a stockpile, but Taiwan did. So that's one difference right there. They had ventilators, they stocked those up, and they had the appropriate tests. Plus, there's one more difference that I've already mentioned, and that is that they stopped all flights from Wuhan, from China, from all of China actually. I know from Wuhan, I'm not sure about the all of China thing, but I believe they just stopped them all. 1 week, 5 days to be exact, before we did. 5 days. Let's just say it's a week, because then we can get back to the Gates, the University of Southampton study. Because what did the University of Southampton say? They said that respectively, the disease could have been limited by 66% had it been conducted 1 week prior, had the preparation started 1 week prior. If it had been started 3 weeks prior, 95%. We could have reduced the number of those who have been confirmed, those who have caught it. We could have reduced the number of those of the deaths. We could have probably, I don't know, let's see. If we extrapolate it out, we would have had 72 deaths by now. You think we would have shut the entire economy down? It's crazy. This is crazy when you really look at the numbers. And this is why Trump is considering getting our economy back to going again. And it's looking more and more to me like May 1st. maybe a date. Do we have to be concerned about doing it too early? Yes, of course. But I have a hunch by May 1st, we're going to have a lot more data that we're going to be able to plug into this equation to find out if it's going to be safe. For example, I've been following, I didn't check it today, but Sweden, this is really interesting. I mean, they had pretty much done nothing. I mean, they've done basic, everybody's wearing masks and basic stuff, but and they've isolated people down to groups of small groups and that sort of thing. I mean, they're just being cautious about and doing testing, lots of testing, but they're not doing any shutdowns of their economy. So it'll be quite interesting to find out how they fare through all of this. So, okay. Now, if we implemented those numbers, by the way, that I just gave you, those are how many deaths would have occurred if we had the same numbers as Taiwan. But what if we implemented the exact same procedures as Taiwan did? Our 13,000, or let's just say if the University of Southampton study proves correct, and it's certainly getting a lot of credibility in the scientific world, let's take the 5%, the 95%, let's reduce our numbers by 95%, folks. Let's do that. This is the best to worst case scenarios, okay? So they say that if we had followed all the necessary protocols right away, we would have reduced our deaths by 95%, right? That means back on December 31st, when Taiwan was warning all of us about the protocols that needed to be taken. Why? Because it was human to human transmissions. Had we followed what Taiwan followed, we would have ended up with 650 deaths when you extrapolate it out to our actual deaths that we have seen today. That's because we didn't follow to a T what the Taiwanese did, and we started a week later as far as banning all flights from China. 650 deaths compared to what? 13,000. Now, if we had started a week earlier than that, we would have reduced our casualties by 86%. In other words, 1,820 folks would have died as compared to the 13,000 we're seeing today. And if we had just started these protocols 1 week earlier, back when the WHO was telling us there was no human-to-human contact, that there was nothing to see here, folks. If we had just started it back then, we would have almost cut our deaths in half to 4,420, more than half, much more than half, a third, basically. Should we have shut the economy down? That's an important question now that we have to start asking. If we could have reduced the deaths to the worst case scenario under this whole formulated plan, it would have been down to 4,420. If you were told back a month ago that our entire economy was going to be shut down because the flu was going to kill 4,420 deaths, you think we would have reacted a little bit differently, because the flu kills a whole lot more than that in the same period of time. What are the figures for the flu? Somewhere around 30,000 to 70,000 a season, per season. So now we're learning a whole different way of looking at this. Now let's go into why this happened. Why would China lie? And more importantly, why would the WHO try to get all of us thinking that there was nothing to see here? Well, did you know that the Director General of the WHO this man named Tedros. Here are some of the things he came out and said. Listen to this. He said travel restrictions to and from China can have the effect of increasing fear and stigma with little public health benefits. Hello? Did you hear that? He was trying to make any country who was imposing travel restrictions against China look racist, basically, by saying that those tactics only create fear. So he was going back to Alinsky tactic number 5. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. He was trying to bully other countries into not stopping travel from China. Here's another thing he said. Quote, the lockdown of people is unprecedented in public health history, which is a lie, by the way. So it is certainly not a recommendation the WHO has made. They're trying to stop the fear. Now, you have to ask yourself why. Why would they try? Why wouldn't China and the WHO be warning all of us about what they knew and when they knew it? That really opens up a whole nother can of worms, doesn't it? Here's another thing he said. Quote, the WHO highly appreciates the tremendous efforts China has made to contain the epidemic. Huh. Really? Why would he go so far out on the limb to protect China? Even our president now has come out and said there's an awful lot that the WHO was saying about China that he's going to look into now. This is all going to come out. Boy, is this going to come out, because let me tell you some of the research I uncovered. Some of it was going to shock you. It did me anyway. Who is this Tedros guy, right? Well, for many, many years, he served as the health minister in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is known as a Marxist country in the past. He has been tied directly to stolen funds, though they could never prove it, but he was intricately involved with the same group of people that stole millions upon millions of dollars from the AIDS programs in Ethiopia. Here's one that's going to throw you. China is currently the largest foreign investor in Ethiopia. Wow, that's weird, isn't it? They're also the second largest investor country in the WHO outside the United States. The United States is number 1 investor. That's why Trump right now is talking about limiting the funds to the WHO. Now, here's another interesting fact that I uncovered. And this is starting to make the rounds in the news. You may have already heard of it, but he recently appointed former Zimbabwe dictator Robert Mugabe. Now, I remember hearing about Robert Mugabe decades ago. This guy is brutal. He's ruthless. He is single-handedly responsible for the murder of so many of his countrymen and a lot of human rights abuses. So what does he do? He names this guy to be the goodwill ambassador to the UN. This was recent, folks. Only because of universal outrage by human rights groups did he have to reverse positions on this. But it tells you where this guy is coming from, doesn't it? Now let's explore who gains from all of this, because you always follow the money. I'm going to throw some things out at you that are going to sound really wacky. But I want you to just bear with me until I completely finish this, because we're wrapping this up now. We're coming to the end of our hour. I already told you that Bill Or did I? No, I haven't yet. Bill Gates, folks, is the largest private donor to the WHO. The largest private donor is Bill Gates. Evidence shows that he owns a patent for a coronavirus. I never even knew you could own a patent for a virus, but you can. He owns a patent for a coronavirus. He also happens to own a company named Inovio Pharmaceuticals. What's significant about Inovio, you ask? Well, you're going to hear about them a lot coming up. I'm already starting to hear snippets of them on the news, but they supposedly have come out with a very impressive vaccine for COVID-19, which is really interesting that the same person who owns a patent on a virus also owns a large share of a pharmaceutical company that just happens to have a vaccine on COVID-19. Now, the first vaccine has already been test trialed on some folks in, I think, Washington State. You heard about that a couple of weeks ago. This is going to be the second trial. You're going to start hearing about this one is going to be put into effect coming up. Now, here's where it gets really weird. You ready for this? Don't go anywhere. You're not going to believe this. Our own Dr. Fauci has really deep, long-lasting connections to a lot of these players. Now, we know he just came out recently and defended this Tedros, the Director General of the UN. You have to ask why. Why is he so protective over somebody that it's all over the news? If you go Google this guy, you're going to find some you're going to ask yourself, how in the world did he ever become Director General of the UN? How does this stuff happen? Well, back in 2001, I've uncovered a group that was just founded in 2001 by the Carnegie Foundation, and their purpose was to reward global philanthropists for good work that they've done around the world. And they had their first award ceremony back in, and who was one of the presenters? This will blow you away. Our own Dr. Fauci. Okay, so that in and of itself doesn't really mean too much. Okay, so I mean, he was world renowned as an AIDS researcher, but when he presented these awards to the benefactors who were named as fantastic philanthropists, listen to the group that got the awards. You ready? The Gates family. Nothing surprising there. David and Lawrence Rockefeller, on behalf of the Rockefeller family. Getting a little murkier. Ted Turner, we all know him, right? But this one's really going to blow you away. George Soros. George Soros has dedicated his life to bringing socialism to the world. He is the grandfather of globalism. Everyone I just named just now is a globalist, including Bill Gates. He doesn't hide from that. Folks, what we are witnessing today is a battle between globalism and free market societies. One of these groups is going to win out. And when you understand that, everything else I just talked about just now makes a whole lot more sense. We have got to connect the dots. Now, last thing I'm going to share with you is that Dr. Fauci worked in Ethiopia since the time of Tedros. He was there at the very same time, and he was part of, when Tedros was part of the leadership. Remember, he was the health minister, I believe it was, when the millions of dollars in aid provided for HIV assistance went missing. But guess who was one of Ethiopia's largest donors at that time? The Clinton Foundation. This has Haiti corruption written all over it, folks. So much so that when I started connecting the dots, I decided this is going to be what I'm going to be busy researching for our show next week. So don't miss it. Tune in next week, folks, to the Deplorable Reports, avenging fake news with fact-based truth. It was great to see you. Until then, stay safe and spread the word. Share it with everyone you know. Thank you for tuning in.